Hello and welcome. I'm Julie Davis, President of City Club. Thank you for joining us for a discussion of our latest research report, The Future of Money in Oregon Politics, Recommendations for Policymakers. As we begin, I want to acknowledge that the land we are on is native land and was stolen from people who lived here for thousands of years. Here in the Portland region, this land is the territory of the Multnomah, Catlamet, and Clackamas, the Tualatin, Kalapuya, and Molalla, the Wasco, Cowlitz, and many other indigenous people who have known the power and beauty of the Columbia and Willamette rivers, lived here, raised their families, and built communities and traditions that live on. Together, we recognize their unbreakable connection to this land, and we honor their resilience, of their ancestors, and the hope of future generations. I'm really excited about our discussion today because after decades of bipartisan agreement that Oregonians should be able to limit campaign finances, we finally have an opportunity to reform how money influences politics in Oregon. I hope you've had a chance to read the excellent report by our volunteer committee, and I hope you will join me as we thank Andrea Williams and Jonathan Rodmacher, co-chairs of the research committee, Zoe Klingman, who wrote the report, and Kathy McLaughlin, Nathan Miles Willis, and Nate Ramsey for their fact-finding insight and analysis. I and my fellow Board of Governors are extremely proud of the work you'll be presenting today. A reminder, the report is free and downloadable at www.pdxcityclub.org. And if you're a City Club member, I want to remind you that you can vote at the conclusion of today's program. As we go along today, if you have a question, you can post it to Twitter using the hashtag stateofthepossible, all one word, or email us at questions@pdxcityclub.org. Thank you to our season sponsors, Chevron, The Standard, and Wells Fargo, for underwriting our State of the Possible series. Also, thank you to our supporting sponsors, Kaiser Permanente and Tonkin Torp, and our partners at Pamplin Media, X-Ray FM, and Merge Design. If you're ever unable to watch our forums, you can listen in at X-Ray's stations, including 91.1 FM and 107.1 FM. It is now my pleasure to welcome Caitlin Baggett Davis, our Program and Research Committee Chair. Caitlin will be moderating today's conversation.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us to talk about campaign finance reform and City Club's latest research. It's so great to have all of us together at our membership event. Members of the panel, why don't each of you wave when I introduce you, which I think David means that I need to have everybody on the screen with me. There we go. So I'm just going to go through. I'm joined today by our amazing research committee co-chairs, Andrea Williams and Jonathan Rodmacher, and the hardest job on any committee, the writer, Zoe Klingman. Now, before we get started, let's talk through how we're going to use our Zoom today and outline our agenda. So for those of you who are in the audience, you, I'm sorry to say, have been muted for the presentation portion of the program. This isn't because we don't care about your voices, we just really want to hear our speakers. However, you can offer ideas and responses in the chat, and we really hope that you'll do so. After the presentation, you'll be automatically moved into small discussion groups where you will not be muted. If you need accommodations for accessibility for those breakout rooms, please share that with Dan Rivas in the chat. That's Dan Rivas, R-I-V-A-S. Now, before we get started, let's invite everyone on Zoom to take a moment to write in the chat. We'd love to see your name, your personal pronouns, and a brief note about why you're here. It could even just be one word. For me, I would use the word democracy. And now I want to ask our audience also to try out your reactions at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Can we see a sea of hearts and claps for our research committee? Great to have all the support. So we'll start today's program with a presentation from the research committee. To prioritize time for those breakout conversations, I've really asked the committee to sprint through this presentation. After that, Jenny Lee, the Deputy Director of the Coalition of Communities of Color, will help illustrate some of the committee's findings about the impacts of finance regulations on small campaigns and campaigns for candidates who are starting without a big donor network, which often include candidates of color and campaigns developed by culturally specific community groups. Once we've heard from our committee and guest, it'll be your turn to talk about how you see money work or not work in Oregon politics. Right around 12:30, we'll be forming breakout groups where you and a few other participants can discuss the research report, share ideas and your experiences, and gather questions for our panel discussion and Q&A. Finally, once the talking's over, if you're a City Club member, you'll get a chance to vote on whether to adopt or reject the latest research. This is a tradition that goes back more than 100 years and is what determines whether City Club is able to advocate for research findings. During today's event, if you're a City Club member, you'll receive an email that will allow you to cast your vote on the research. If you think you're a City Club member and did not receive the email, send an email to info@pdxcityclub.org. Okay, before we dive in, I also want to express my deep gratitude to the research committee members who worked on this recent report. You have done outstanding work on a really short timeline, and you've given us a lot to discuss. So, Andrea, I believe you're kicking off the conversation. Can you tell us about the purpose of the research?
Sure. Thanks, Caitlin. Hi, everyone. I'm Andrea Williams, one of the co-chairs of the research committee. And, the purpose of this report is really intended to be a guide, taking into consideration and recalling that in November 2020, just a few months ago, Oregonians overwhelmingly passed Measure 107, which allowed the Oregon legislature and local governments to enact a wide variety of campaign finance regulations. So our committee was really looking at and charged with providing a set of criteria and recommendations to policymakers, especially as we enter into this legislative session, in consideration of how they really want political campaigns to be paid for in our state. Of note is that the report is not intended to draft specific legislation or recommend any particular policy. Rather, we hope that policymakers take our sort of big picture values and recommendations into consideration as they are crafting policy. And we really approached this task with a set of core values and goals in mind. Those included that any new campaign finance regulations should promote a political system that is more equitable and representative, fair and unbiased, small d democratic, trusted, transparent, and accountable. And, we really wanted to include a variety of voices. We met over the course of 8 weeks, and we really spoke to 17 witnesses representing a variety of stakeholders, from campaign finance reformers to labor unions to business associations, organizations led by Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and also policymakers.
Great. Jonathan, can you give us a thumbnail introduction to the legal context to the report?
Sure. Thank you, Caitlin. About 50 years ago, in the wake of Watergate, citizens across the country saw a need for campaign finance reform, and the City Club of Portland was joined in that chorus, issuing a report in '73 highlighting the need to regulate campaign finance. It highlighted as examples of how outrageous spending was that a presidential campaign was $50 million, a Senate campaign was $700,000, and the Portland mayor's race cost $134,000, numbers that now, of course, are paltry by comparison. But both at the federal and at a variety of state levels, regulations were imposed. The Federal Election Commission was created. But in 1976, the Supreme Court struck down expenditure limitations, allowed contribution limitations. That system changed in 2010 when Citizens United where the Supreme Court said money is speech and corporate money is also speech. And since then, we've seen campaign finance struck down at a number of levels. Statewide, our Supreme Court had said can't restrict anything in terms of expenditures and even contributions at some level. But now with the passage of Measure 107, the landscape is bare in terms of state law for legislators and city councils to create a system of campaign finance reform that is legal under Oregon law.
All right, thanks for the background, both of you. Let's turn to your committee's findings. I'm going to put up a slide here for all the visual learners / me. And Andrea, can you talk us through finding number 1 and then hand it to Zoe?
Sure, thank you. So since one of our values was really seeking a representative democracy, one of our key findings was that, and we use the term BIPOC here, but that stands for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color, that their voices really must be at the center of policy development. And, we talked quite a bit about what does that mean? What does centering people's voices mean? And, it was really important for us to define that as that we are engaging these communities and their leadership and their advocates early and throughout the decision-making process, which means that they should play a really critical role where decisions are being made so that they can help define the details and shape priorities within any type of campaign finance reform system. That also means engaging people long-term, recognizing that so many of our BIPOC communities are stretched so thin, having to deal with the multiple crises we are all really got to look at this as a long-term conversation in which, that is resourced, that has time to fully engage the diversity of our communities here in our state. So I'll pass it to Zoe to talk about finding number 2.
Sure. Thank you, Andrea. So finding number 2, I think, is pretty connected to number 1, and that's that we recommend that new regulations be tailored so that they don't become a barrier to entry for underrepresented voices. And this comes from the recognition that there's really an enormous variety in the size and sophistication of campaigns and other organizations who do political work in Oregon. And what we heard from people who do this work on the ground is that new regulations, changing paperwork, administrative requirements can be quite burdensome. And that's especially an issue for organizations from underrepresented communities who might not have the knowledge or resources of other organizations. So some of the specific things we recommended were ensuring that new rules are clear and understandable, even to people without a law degree, that when there's new regulations, there's opportunities for training and education and time to transition to new rules, and that when we levy penalties, that they're proportional to the size of the violation. But there are a lot of ways for policymakers to be thoughtful about how to best to achieve the goals of a policy without unintentionally blocking people out.
All right. Andrea, I think this brings us back to you for finding 3, and then you can hand it to Jonathan,
Yes.
who can hand it to Zoe. We got a relay.
Sounds good. So finding number 3 is that contribution limits should be data-driven and contextual. And this is really important because we have to really be careful so we're not in creating contribution limits, we're not actually creating unintended consequences for candidates in elections. Our witnesses outlined a variety of risks if contribution limits are too restricted, and it could have a disproportionate impact on a variety of people. But 2 kinds of candidates to highlight. One is as a new candidate who's mounting a challenge against an incumbent. New candidates may not necessarily have that kind of built up support or a donor base that an incumbent might have. The other is that candidates who have less institutional support and backing, especially our Black, Indigenous, and People of Color candidates, and people from underrepresented communities who may not have the same kinds of access to resources some of our longer standing candidates might have. We also heard that, overly restricting campaign contributions could actually discourage deeper investments in expanding the electorate. such as hard to reach communities. Voter outreach is expensive and it's time intensive. And with limited resources available, campaigns may be incentivized to focus only on people that are high turnout, who are generally older, white, and better off. And so we want to make sure that campaigns do have the resources to actually, turn out and increase the voter base that they have. And that actually takes resources. And so the committee really recommends that policymakers minimize these risks by taking data and context into account when setting contribution limits. And at a minimum, policymakers should consider what campaigns are currently spending in terms of like their baseline costs, mailers, television, ads, staff, for example, and that they should allow for adjustments for inflation. And then the other thing is that, a variety of witnesses spoke about the varying media markets, and that it really depends on where your campaign is happening and which media market you're in, and the cost associated with that. And so we really encourage policymakers to not rely solely on their own personal experience running for office, but rather they should take into a broader set of data across the state to really determine and set those contribution limits. And with that, I'll hand it to Jonathan for finding number 4.
Thanks. Transparency is our finding number 4. And at first blush, transparency, of course, is not a campaign finance contribution limit, but it seemed like with money flowing into campaigns, it's important that citizens have access to information about who is funding campaigns, whether it's ballot measure campaigns, which, by the way, the Constitution would never allow the kind of contribution limits we're talking about when you're talking about ballot measure campaigns, because the corruption interests aren't there. But transparency is important for both ballot measure campaigns and candidate campaigns. And most of our witnesses agreed that ORSTAR, our present system for campaign finance transparency, is a pretty good system, both because it's relatively easy to work with and because it's pretty accessible to the average citizen. But there were some cautions given to us by some witnesses that we also wanted to encourage policymakers to be aware of. And that is that if campaign transparency requirements are too onerous, you tend to either punish people who don't have a lot of experience, and so any newcomer in the system can be hurt badly for violations that really are not that bad. And so it's important to keep a transparency, but as regulations are imposed, that policymakers pay attention to the need to make those requirements easy, not too punitive, and accessible to those who are newcomers to the political system. With that, I'll hand to Zoe.
Great. Thank you, Jonathan. So our final finding was that contribution limits alone aren't enough to build the system we want. And oftentimes the first thing that you think about when you think about campaign finance reform is limits, limiting the amount of money that's raised and spent in our political system. Oh, yes. Thank you. Okay, I will start over. So our final finding was that contribution limits aren't enough to build the system we want. A real theme in our research was that contribution limits that limit the amount of money that's raised and spent on our political system aren't enough to achieve our goals, like getting a more diverse group of people into office and engaging more Oregonians in the political process. So, for instance, we heard pretty consistently that contribution limits won't do enough to make our elected officials more diverse and more representative. Limits don't change the fact that candidates need institutional support and a network of donors to successfully run for office, which are both things that we know BIPOC candidates are less likely to have access to. So I won't go into all of the other policy ideas we consider. They're all in the report. I encourage you to read it. But they include public financing, which has the potential to break down those barriers for people to run for office. And so I think just to tie it up, if legislators and local leaders pass contribution limits this year, that'll be an important step to addressing some of the issues that we identify in the report. But it'll be far from the end of the conversation about how to improve our campaign finance system.
Great. Thank you all for walking us through those findings. Before we turn to our guest, Jenny Lee, I'm wondering if you could each share what surprised you while you were doing this research. What did you learn? Maybe I'll start with Jonathan.
All right, thanks, Caitlin. I was surprised, especially doing the background research. Everybody talked about, or almost everybody talked about, there's just too much money in politics. But as we talk to witnesses and as you really get into the literature, it doesn't seem like people think there's too much money. And maybe it's just we recognize under Citizens United there's going to be a lot of money out there. But our free marketplace of ideas encourages people to get their voice heard. And one way to reach people who are disconnected from politics is to reach out to them with advertising and campaigns, and that costs money. And so I'm not sure that any of us thought money needs to be tamped down as much as regulated and made transparent.
That's really interesting. I can see why that would be a surprising experience going through this research. You do hear that it's all about money and politics. Andrea, what about you? Did anything surprise you?
Yeah, I mean, I went into this report thinking with a very narrow focus on contribution limits. But it turns out that witnesses really had a much broader perspective in mind in how to achieve, a fair, representative, engaging democracy, and that campaign contribution limits are a factor. Yes, that's important. But like as Zoe was saying with number 5, there's just a much broader set of democracy reforms and other campaign finance policy needed in order to achieve our ideal system. And so I'm just like I was surprised by that because I wasn't expecting there to be such a robust conversation about all the other things that we need to do in addition to, or maybe as a package with these campaign contribution limit policies.
It's a complex policy space for sure. Zoe, did anything come up that you thought was remarkable or surprising in the process?
Yeah, I think the thing that really stuck out to me that I wasn't quite aware of going in was just how big of an opportunity this is for Oregon to change how our system works. For the most part, we haven't had meaningful campaign finance regulations in place for decades in Oregon, and that's had a really tangible effect both on our politics, but also on the types of policies that our leaders have taken up. And so our report has a lot of caution in it, but I don't think we want to lose sight of the fact that voters have spoken up pretty clearly about what they want and that our elected leaders have a real chance to do something this year.
Awesome. In our board conversation, the thing that really surprised us, within the values framework of looking at this whole policy area through the lens of increasing accessibility and equity, the realization that we want regulations and a system that reduces corruption, but we don't want regulations that make it harder for particularly BIPOC community members, but also rural candidates, candidates who don't start out with a big donor network. We don't want the kind of regulations that would make it hard for those candidates and organizations to be involved in politics. And so with that in mind, we asked Jenny Lee, the Deputy Director of the Coalition of Communities of Color, to share some thoughts based on running campaigns and working with candidates and advocacy groups who try to work in this space. So let me welcome Jenny. Hi.
Thank you. At first, I appreciate so much the opportunity to be here and also the work of the City Club and the Research Committee in producing this report. I'm very excited to vote on it today. And so I guess this is sort of my conversation. It's a little bit fluid. So I do work with a 501c4. I also have some examples from volunteer work I've done on candidate campaigns. So the goal is to sort of illustrate some of how this actually plays out or some kind of things to consider, cautionary tales in this work. So I'd like to start actually with, despite the challenging features of our campaign finance landscape and money in politics, we have seen incredible growth in representation of BIPOC communities, their interests, and candidates that come from those communities, and actually winning and getting elected. So this is a huge testament to the work of community members, culturally specific C4s in making this a reality. So I'd like to lift up some of the points and apply a little bit to the report. And I hope that these challenges illustrate a little bit better of how sometimes the letter of the law and our regulations don't actually match up with the intentions like those articulated today. And that there are unique challenges to elevating the voices of underrepresented communities and emerging candidates that lack access to donors and networks. So with regard to perception and fairness, there's a lot that comes up, and specifically, I think some of the strongest examples of challenges have actually been around disclosure. So there are legitimate concerns that can be in tension with perception and fairness. So first, BIPOC representing social welfare organizations, 501c4s, can have a real risk when being required to disclose their donors, as has been discussed at the state level and exists at the city of Portland. We know that BIPOC community leaders have been on the receiving end of violent threats and that donors can become targets. And this chills our ability for freedom of association and to take action politically. A specific example for the social welfare organizations that I work with, actually our largest funders are definitely foundations. And so that tension of affiliating a foundation with support for a particular candidate, when that's not really the goal, can muddy those waters even further and implicate some very important players in broader civic engagement. So organizations with more power and privilege are much more insulated in who they can put out there and publicly affiliate with. Similarly, they have more alternatives with independent expenditures. One of the other pieces there is in terms of access to national support. That's really critical that we partner with think tanks, policymakers, and sometimes those are folks involved in candidate and ballot measure campaigns that they're able to drive the work forward and bring resources to Oregon, but they might actually be out of state and doing some of this innovative work. I would say actually one thing then on transparency, that ORSTAR can actually be pretty challenging to use, even as an observer, calculating regulations, knowing what kind of organizations these really are, how well resourced they are. That can take a lot of additional research to really get at what I think we are trying to communicate with campaign finance reporting. And certainly on the campaign side, even the most grassroots of campaigns, I believe there are very few that would not use the professional services of a treasurer and contract that out because the risks are just too high. So essentially a prerequisite. And so thinking about this on the ground, how functional has this been? One of the biggest challenges is a lack of clarity, training, and technical assistance that really leaves us adrift at sea. More stringent campaign finance regulations, of course, require intensive training. So there's little capacity to do that, and it's not yet been accessible. So specifically to the 2020 election cycle in Portland, and I'm sure folks at the city were doing the best they can, but there was really no way to understand the regulations up front. So I would repeatedly check the city auditor's website to see what campaign complaints had been filed and if they were found to be in violation, because that was really the only guidance I had, was to say, all right, someone else messed up here and the auditor agrees. So specific, what I thought was a very straightforward question, asking, what does contrasting text mean on a website or a mailer? Like, is that a different color? And I was just pointed to the regulation and told consult outside legal counsel. So we were trying to meld good graphic design with legal compliance. And really, how do you do that then without essentially having an elections attorney on retainer for your campaign? And again, not realistic to add that expense additionally. So right now, there's some active review and legal action over simple social media posts and how to disclose with that. And so ultimately, it doesn't feel like that was actually the intent necessarily of regulations. The goal was transparency and meaningful understanding, and that the system right now actually might end up being actually obscuring some of how this really works because of the emphasis on the precision in disclosures. And then finally, I wanted to raise up how this fits into the broader landscape of building inequities across the board. One example there would be around budgeting, and that ultimately it takes staff to run even the most grassroots of campaigns. No matter how much volunteer power you have, someone needs to marshal that. But right now, generally campaign staff are paid as independent contractors, maybe around $3,000 a month for basically 60 plus hours of work per week at a minimum, without any benefits. And campaigns are actually one of the most powerful pathways for getting folks into to access political power, to become leaders in their community. So even for myself, the only way I was able to volunteer was because I had a salaried day job. So ultimately, this really, I believe, is the right moment. And I'm so grateful for taking action on this to consider how we can build a more representative democracy that really works for BIPOC communities, those with less resources, and bring those folks into the halls of power and reshape how our state looks. So thank you for this chance to share some of that.
Thank you, Jenny. All right, it's time for our breakout sessions, time for all of you to get a chance to talk with each other. You should be seeing a Google Doc in the chat right about now. Dan will be sharing a link. And that doc will take you to instructions for your breakout groups, and also a linked document where you can put in questions. They'll come back to me so that we can share them with our guests. In a moment, you'll be randomly placed in these virtual meeting spaces with about 5 people, and each breakout room will choose a facilitator and a note taker who will help you to stay organized and make sure that the highlights of your discussion are shared with everybody. If questions do come up from your committee, I hope that you will put them in that Google Doc, and we'll share them during our Q&A. Okay, we're going to place you in breakout rooms now, and we'll yank you back in 14 minutes, so we have plenty of time for the Q&A. Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back. I'm sorry to tear you away from the discussion you were having. I know how that feels when you're just about to explain your aha moment and it's like, where'd everybody go? But time to pull back from the conversations you were having and share some of your questions with our panel. We've learned a lot today and have been part of some interesting discussions. So we want to be sure that we get your questions answered before we move to a vote. I'm looking at the list of questions in the Google Doc, and I want to start with this thorny one. Committee, you focused on broad criteria, which is helpful, but the devil is in the details. What do you think is the most devilish detail that lawmakers will need to work out? Who wants to pick that up?
Well, this is Jonathan. We probably all have different ideas on that. We talked a lot about publicly financed campaigns as a committee, and I would think that maybe this isn't quite in detail, but I would think that legislators choosing to go down that path are going to be making a very difficult decision, but one that we think is really important if we're going to choose if we're going to accomplish the objectives of equity that were really important to us. I think that would be a hard decision as a legislator, whether to go down that path or not.
Others?
Well, I think Andrea mentioned this during our overview of the findings, but policymakers are going to have to decide where they're going to set those contribution limits. And that's a decision that it will have an impact on what kind of impacts we'll see on the ground for this policy. So that will be an important decision also.
As you were doing research, did you come across national resources or best practices guides related to the level of limits, resources that you would advise policymakers to look at?
That's interesting. We didn't, although that doesn't mean that they don't exist out there. The National Conference of State Legislators, NCSL, has voluminous amounts of information about what contribution limits and campaign finance policies look like in every state. So that was actually a very helpful resource for us as well.
Jenny, do you have anything to add in on the devil in the details? You brought up a bunch of details.
Yeah, a lot. If I were thinking on the contribution side, one of those I think would be the balance, like a small donor pack, how you are able to pool voices of folks to build power using money. But then that's I think striking that determination about contributions will be certainly challenging in the structure of what does a small donor pack look like.
Now, as a committee, you were focused on developing criteria, not on specific legislation, but you did talk to lawmakers. Can you give us a sense of who is moving forward specific policies this session, and did they give you any indication of the possibility of something moving forward at the state level?
I can probably speak to that. There's a couple legislators who have been involved in this issue for a while. One of them is Representative Rayfield down in Corvallis. Another is Senator Golden, who represents Ashland, the Ashland area. And they are both Democrats. They have fairly different takes on exactly some of those details that we've been talking about. So I know that both of those legislators are going to be having conversations about that this year. We also spoke to Representative Andrea Salinas, who's been leading some of these conversations as well. And I think the outlook that we got from those folks was that this is something that many people in the legislature are very interested in making progress on this year. I would never want to be someone who makes a prediction about what happens during a legislative session, especially this legislative session. So I can't say whether that means that something will pass or something meaningful will pass. But we did hear that there's a lot of interest in making progress on this issue this year, even as there's a lot of other things happening during the legislative session.
I don't understand. You don't want to make a crystal ball prediction at the beginning of this legislative session about what might happen tomorrow? Never mind. All right, fair enough. One of our groups asked, if the recommendations are enacted, which level of government would be most affected? I feel like there are a couple of different ways to come at this, but it is interesting to think about the way that different levels of government engage with campaign finance, and I think that's something that your committee talked about. Jonathan's looking.
Jonathan looks at his thoughts.
I'm a little puzzled by the question. Certainly the Measure 107 allows the state legislature to act, but we know that Multnomah County and the city of Portland have, whether through their own regulation or through ballot measures, have tried to implement different kinds of campaign finance regulation. And I expect that there'll be some supremacy issues, right? That city of Portland can't step on the state's toes. The state can probably step on the city of Portland's toes. We didn't try and sort through those kinds of issues much.
Okay. Here's another one that might draw on your legal expertise, Jonathan. Question, is there a way to bar contributions from outside the state to candidates and ballot measures? They go on to say, the citizens of Oregon must not be lied to, fooled, or confused by non-Oregon outside the state money. External state flowing into the state is detrimental and pollutes Oregonians' ballot measures and candidates. Is there a way to bar out-of-state contributions?
We didn't hear anybody suggest that was possible, and I would think that money is speech, and so you have a right to spend $1 in California just like you have a right to spend $1 in Oregon. I would think there'd be interstate commerce problems on top of First Amendment problems with discriminating on the basis of where the dollar came from. That's just my guess.
Yeah,
I would just add to that. Oops, sorry.
Go ahead.
I would just add, the remedy that at least came forth through our witness conversations was really one about transparency. How can we be more transparent about the donors behind the PACs? You know, how do we get to the original source of the money? So, and make that public so that voters truly understand what the motivation is behind this particular ballot measure campaign or contribution to a candidate. So that was kind of the one thing that I think we were able to identify is how can we enhance our transparency measures.
One of the surprising findings, I think, for your committee, Andrea, you brought this up, was a focus on public finance. And so we have a question here about why that came up in a research committee that was focused on limiting contributions. Can you explain more about the role of public finance? Andrea, do you want to? Oh, go ahead, Zoe.
I mean, I think the short answer is that our witnesses brought it up. We heard from a number of witnesses that limiting contributions is important. It's not enough to meet the goals that we're looking at meeting. It's not enough to break down barriers for people who otherwise don't have as much access to public office. I don't know if Andrew, you have other things to add.
You know, I think it's also, you know, public financing is also about how do you incentivize small donors to give? How do you ensure that lower income people who want to engage in the process, who are maybe newer electorates, want to support a candidate? How can you really enhance and encourage their participation when a candidate really excites them? And on the other hand, how do you support a candidate whose base is largely low income, who may not have access to large donors like other candidates might have? And so it was kind of from a how do you encourage you know, that small D democracy, that grassroots small dollar contributions, while also supporting our candidates who might have connections to a vast number of people, but they may not be people who have connection to wealth. So I think, you know, that the public campaign financing system seemed to support some of those goals.
Great. Those are all the questions that we have time for today. I wish that we had more time. Thank you, Andrea, Jonathan, Zoe, and Jenny, for sharing your expertise and your perspectives with us today. Now it's time for us to turn to the process for City Club members to vote. But before I do that, I do want to invite our audience overall to share your thoughts with us, share your thoughts about research that we should take up in the future, and how this event worked for you. We're all making it up in a new space online, and really great to have you all here today. So, City Club members, if you're a member, you should have by now received an email that will allow you to cast a simple up-down vote on our research. If you feel the research was carried out faithfully and its conclusions follow from the findings, you can vote to approve the research. You will have until Sunday night at 11:59 p.m. to cast your ballot. If you are in the audience and you're not a member, it is not too late to join. Go to pdxcityclub.org/membership to sign up, and then email info@pdxcityclub.org to have a ballot sent to you. It's important to take both of those steps, and we'll welcome you as a member and welcome your vote. Thank you all for being part of today's discussion, and thank you again to the Research Committee for all your hard work on this project, and to our sponsors, Chevron, The Standard, Wells Fargo, Kaiser Permanente, and Tonkin Torp for your support today. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon, everybody. Have a good end of the week, and thanks for participating. We appreciate you. Bye.